For years, the biggest problem with George Karl was accountability. It was always someone else's fault. Whether it was the road schedule, the new roster, the old roster, no stars, too many stars, whatever, it was always there. Karl was so good at making excuses that he even brainwashed many of the media members that covered his team on a daily basis. You would think that Terry Fry and Sandy Clough were sleeping over at Karl's house on Friday nights, having pillow fights in their onesies, the way that they would defend him every Saturday afternoon. It was sick. When the Nuggets won, it was George. When the Nuggets lost, it was the players. One evening, Gil Whiteley was so pissed off at what I had said about George Karl on my show that he told me never to call him again and that I didn't know what I was talking about. Now, I have a lot of respect for Gil's knowledge of the game and his ability to measure success, but I was blown away by the defense mechanisms that he deployed. I have never seen more passion for a failing head coach in my life than I saw for curious George Karl. What's funny is that the older you are, the more you love George. George defeated cancer twice and instantly became untouchable. Respectfully, there is nothing more inspiring in the world than that. I'll always respect George for that and the strength that he showed in order to move on from it. I mean, cancer is no joke, guys, and George beat it twice. And kudos to George, and he was inspiring in doing so. He's a great human being, a great man, a great teacher. But unfortunately, when Coach Karl's teams found themselves with their backs against the wall in basketball, in a must-win situation, and all eyes were on him, the determination, the poise, the leadership, and the ability to motivate disappeared. George is one of those guys that'll always say, well, if he would have just done this, or I was so close to achieving that. It's always shoulda, coulda, woulda with Mr. Karl. Josh Kroenke got tired of it, and so did I. Me and Josh Kroenke are around the same age, and I believe that the younger generation demands more and at a faster rate than the older generation of folks that grew up watching quarterbacks take 5 years to develop and allowed coaches to marinate on the same bench for decades. You have to be completely oblivious to assume that George Karl's playoff failures weren't his fault. If you line up the top 19 NBA coaches with the most playoff wins of all time, if you line up the top 19 NBA coaches with the most playoff wins of all time, George Karl has the lowest winning percentage of them all. It's simple. His brand of basketball doesn't win in the playoffs, and his inability to outcoach the opposition in crucial moments when plays need to be drawn up or the right substitution has to be made. That was the glaring weakness of his entire career. Recently, George Karl made an appearance on CBS 4 in Denver with Vic Lombardi. And listen, I would consider Vic to be the greatest sports media member in this market's history. A guy that I've leaned on over the past few years for advice and information. But Vic is another one of these guys that swears on the ability to George Karl. It doesn't make you a bad guy for loving George. It just baffles me. I just don't agree with it. I just don't understand it. George told Vic that he thought Josh Kroenke made the decision to fire him off of emotion. What I found very compelling in that statement is that George never understood how to make decisions when emotion was involved. George never understood how to make decisions when emotion was involved. Think about that. This is the guy that had the moxie to go against the grain for the betterment of the franchise. He fired the coach of the year. He took a risk. He took a risk and had the moxie to go against the grain. Those are two attributes that we never saw from George Karl. George said that he thinks Kroenke put himself in a big hole, and that might be true. But at least now, the room for improvement has been created. The possibility of winning in the playoffs is there, and many people would take the risk of being in a big hole rather than knowing that the inevitable outcome of every year was a first-round playoff exit. George told Josh Kroenke that he was making a stupid decision, which gives you an idea of the entitlement and the elitist attitude that George Karl carries within himself. It's fascinating to me that a coach who never showed an aggressive nature and always faltered in the face of on-court adversity now has the mettle to tell the owner that he's stupid. The term 57 wins is uttered in all of the interviews that George did within the past week, but the playoff record was never uttered once. George was in Denver for 9 years, almost an entire decade, and only moved past the first round of the playoffs one time. That is a bottom line number, and that bottom line shows a losing tradition, a tradition that is now gone. Josh Kroenke is ready to take a chance on a title, and so am I. Goodbye, George Karl.